In our last video, we were able to create the dashboard page, okay? But currently as it is, any user can access our dashboard, but the way it should be, only signed in users should be able to access the dashboard, okay? So in this video, we'll be managing our access, okay, to public routes and to protected route, and we'll be doing that using Next.js middleware. The way the middleware works is such that whenever you are sending a request to the server, the middleware will first run before your request gets to its destination and subsequently processed, okay? So now we'll be creating a middleware to check the request that the user is sending. If the user is sending a request to a protected route, then we are going to first verify if the user is signed in. If the user is not signed in, then from the middleware, we are going to redirect them to the signed in page before they get to the dashboard. And if they are signed in, we just allow them to pass through. Okay, so to create your middleware should be directly inside of this source page. All right, I'm going to collapse everything. Okay, so on this source, you are going to create your middleware file. Okay, so we have middleware.ts. Okay, so we need to export a function from our middleware. All right, okay, let's just export default. Okay, and then we're going to have an async function, async function. So we're going to call it middleware. Okay, so this is going to be a request. Okay, it's going to be of the data type next request. Okay, so we need to import that. This is type, not the actual next request. Okay, we also need to export a config object. Okay, so we're going to have export, then const config. Okay, so in this config object, we are going to, this is going to be equal to, in this config object, we are going to stipulate the route that we want the middleware to execute for. Okay, so we're going to have a matcher property, matcher. Okay, so this matcher is going to contain an array. The array is going to be containing all the routes that we want this middleware to execute for. Okay, so I'm just going to paste the route. All right, so in this project, we want the middleware to execute for our home page, want it to execute for sign in, for sign up, for dashboard, and for forgot password. Okay, all these pages like homepage, sign in, sign up, and forgot password, all of them, they are public routes. Okay, so they should be accessible to users that are not signed in, but any user that is already signed in should not be able to access all these routes. Okay, like the sign in page, any user that is already signed in should not be able to access the sign in page again. Any user that is signed in should not access sign up and also forgot password. But for dashboard page, only users that are signed in should be able to access it. So we'll be handling for both public routes. We'll be handling the public route and the protected routes in this middleware. Okay, so first off, let's group the routes in an array. So we're going to group the related routes together. So let's call it public routes. Okay, so this is going to be an array that will contain all our public routes. Okay, so I'm going to copy this and paste this in here. All right, I'm going to have another array for protected routes. Routes. All right, these are not all the routes that are existing in this application, but these are the routes that we want this middleware to only be executed for. All other routes, they can just go freely. Okay, now let's work on middleware. So inside of our middleware, we're going to have a variable with the name path name. So that is the variable that is going to be holding the actual path of the page that the user wants to access. Okay, so we're going to get that from request.nexturl.pathname. Okay, so now we are going to check the if the path that the user wants to access is either in the protected route or it's in the public route. Okay, so we're going to say if, okay, first off, let's undo the protected route first off. So we're going to say if protected route dot includes, okay, So path name, if our protected route if the path name is part of our protected route, in other words, if the page that the user wants to access is part of our protected route, then we are going to undo it. Let's have a comment here. Okay, so we're going to say undo protected route. Okay, so after that we can also undo the public route. Okay, so let's have a comment, and then we're going to say undo public route. Okay, so here let's have a conditional statement for this. I'm going to say if public route dot includes, then we're going to have a path name. Okay, and let's have the block for this. On that do, you're going to create that. Okay, so that is going to undo our public route. And for other routes that are not either in the public or protected route, let's as default, okay, this part of the code should never execute, but just as a safeguard. So we are going to have next response. We are going to be redirecting all of those requests back to the sign-in page, but this part of the code should not run ordinarily, okay, because these are all the routes that the middleware should execute for, okay, and all the route all of them have been grouped into public and protected routes, okay. So it is either this condition is true or this condition is true, but just as a safeguard, we are going to be redirecting any extraneous request to the sign in page. Okay, so we're going to have this is going to be a string, then we're going to have sign in, it should be lowercase sign in. Okay, and here we're going to have a request.url. okay, these are just for possible extraneous request. Okay, so we're going to say let's just call it extraneous to run. All right, so now let's undo protected route. Okay, like for example our dashboard page, our dashboard should be protected. It should only be accessible for users that are signed in. Okay, so first off, we are going to validate the user session. So we're going to have const, and we're going to say session is equal to await. Then we are going to have a function that we're going to call our check session. Okay, so we're going to create the session outside of this middleware. I'm going to have a sync function. We could have just written all of the logic here, but we are going to be using the same logic for both public and protected routes. So rather than duplicating the logic, we can just put them in a function, and then we can call it for both parts of the middleware. All right, so here we are going to have a request. We're going to be passing the request to the function. Okay, so we're going to have request, and data type is going to be next request. Okay, don't forget to import your response. Okay, so you need to import that if VS Code did not import it for you automatically. So we're going to have a try catch block. Okay, so first off, we need to get our session ID. So we have a session ID. Okay, so we'll be getting it from the cookies that we store in the user's browser. We're going to have request.cookies.get. Okay, and the key for our session ID, let's create a variable here. Okay, just like we did in our session file, we're going to call it cookie session key, and the session key is just session ID. We could have imported it from our session file, but because we are using the crypto file in our session file, and crypto is based on Node.js, while Next.js middleware is running on Edge runtime, so it is going to cause error. All right, this is not a Node runtime. All right, so we need to recreate this cookie session key. Okay, so we're going to pass the key here. So we're going to have cookie session key. All right, so if this session ID is existing on the cookie, then we are going to be extracting the value out of the cookie. All right, now we need to check if the cookie is available. So I'm going to say if session ID is not true. Okay, so if session ID is not true, then we are going to be returning an object Okay, so the object is going to have a property is valid. I think something happened there. No, we are not getting this. Sorry, we are not getting this from Zod. Okay, so I'm going to say is valid is false. Okay, that means the session is not valid. Okay, I guess we should create a data type for the return value of this check session function. Since it's an async function, then that means going to return a promise. Okay, the promise is going to resolve into session check result. We're going to create the data type result. All right, so now let's create this data type. So we're going to say session check result. This is going to be an object. So inside of the object, we're going to have is valid, which is going to be false. Okay, so if the session is not valid, then this value is going to be false. And we're also going to have another property which we are going to call delete session. Okay, this is going to be an optional property. If it is provided, then it should be true. We're going to use this property to detect if we need to delete the user session for invalid sessions. Okay, but if the session is valid, then we're going to have is valid to be true. Okay, to signify valid sessions. And if the session is valid, then we need to return the session ID. So this is going to be string. All right, and we need to return the user structure. Okay, so this is going to be of data type user session. Okay, so we need to also create this user session. We can say type user session. Okay, so we're going to be inferring this from user schema. So user session schema. Schema. We need to import this. We're going to be importing this from Zod library. Okay, so we're going to have import, and I'm going to have user session schema from. Okay, so I think that one has woken up. And this is going to be zip.infer. Okay, then we're going to have type of, then we have a user session schema. Okay, so we need to provide that user session as the data type of this. Okay, now we are good with our data types. All right, so let's proceed with validating our user session. Okay, so if the session is not available on the cookie, we're going to return is valid to be false. Okay, so after checking if the session ID is available on the cookies on the request, then we are going to be getting the user from our database. So if it gets to this point, that means there is a session ID. There is a session session ID available on the request cookies. Okay, so we need to check our database to validate if the session is actually valid. Okay, so we're going to be using our Redis client. So I'm going to have .get. Okay, so we need to provide the key for the user session. So we're going to have base auth. Okay, this is just the same as what we have in our session file. If you check our session file, okay, so it is just the same as this. All right, I'm going to go back to our middleware. So I'm going to have interpolation. Then I'm going to have a session ID. So that is going to get the user for us if the user is in a database. But so now we're going to check if the user is not in a database. That means the session ID is not available. It's not valid. So we're going to be returning an object. Okay, so it's valid is going to be false. Okay, because the session is not available in our database, and we need to delete the session from the user browser. Okay, so the delete session is going to be true. All right, because the user is having a session on their browser that is not available in our database, so we need to delete the session from the user browser. Okay, so if the user is also available in our database, then we are going to be returning a valid session from this function. So we're going to have an object is valid is going to be true. Okay, we also need to return the session ID, and we also need to return the user. Okay, so we are going to validate it using a schema. Okay, to ensure that the structure follows the structure we are using in our app. Okay, so we are going to pass it with the Zod schema. All right, if there is an error passing the user we got from our database, actually there should be no error because we are the one that still define the structure of the user we are storing in our Redis database. But under any unfortunate circumstance, if it fails this passing, then we are going to be catching the error here. So we are just going to return its value to be false. Okay, this also is going to undo if there was an error making this network request to our database. Let's get rid of this because we are not using that. All right, so we need to pass our request to this check session function. Now we have checked the user session if it is valid or not valid. All right, so here let's see if the session is not valid. I'm going to say if our session dot is valid. Okay, so if it is not true, that means this is a protected route. So if the user session is not true, then we are going to be redirecting them to the sign in page. Okay, so let's create a response object here. We have response. Okay, that's going to be next response dot redirect because their session is not valid, so we'll be redirecting them to the sign in page. Okay, so I have new URL, then I'm going to provide sign ins. All right, this is going to be request dot URL. Okay, but before we return the response, let's check if we should delete the user session in cases that there is a session ID on the user's browser and the session is not in our database. So we are going to check if session, okay, dot delete session. If that is true, then we need to delete the cookie from the user's browser. So we are going to have response dot cookies dot delete. Okay, then we are going to pass the cookie key, which is going to be session ID that we defined at this point. Okay, so what is the error? Cannot find Zod. Okay, I'm going to import zip from Zod. Okay, now after checking if we should delete the session, then we are going to be returning our response. Okay, it's going to be return response. Okay, so that is going to redirect the user to the sign in page for invalid sessions. Okay, but if the session is valid, okay, so that means we should allow the user to proceed to the dashboard page. All right, so I'm going to return a next response that should allow the user to proceed to the dashboard page. So I'm just going to say next response dot next, which means the user session is valid, proceed to the dashboard page. But before we proceed to the dashboard page, there are times that we may need maybe the user ID or the user role, okay, on the page that the user is trying to visit. Actually, we can just leave it at this point, and then on the page that the user wants to access, for example, the dashboard page, we can now access the cookies, get the user session, check our database. If the session is in our database, then we can now get the user ID from the Redis database and use it for whatever purpose we want to use it for. But since we've made the database check in the middleware, it is kind of redundant to still go and make another database check in our page. So we can just pass along the user ID and their role on this request so that we can just grab the user ID and the role from the request rather than making a duplicate database check. Okay, so we are going to be passing the user ID and their role alongside the request down to the page. Okay, so to do that, we're going to be attaching the user ID and their role to the request headers. Okay, so that we can just, if we need the ID or the role, we can just grab it from the headers in the page rather than making another request down to the Redis database. Okay, so to attach the user ID to the request header, we are going to first duplicate, we are first going to clone the current headers on the request. Okay, so I'm going to have const, and then we're going to have a request headers. Okay, so we are going to clone all the current headers in the request. Okay, so that's going to be request, all right, request, okay, dot headers. Okay, so that's going to clone all the current headers on the request. Then we're going to be adding the user ID as part of the headers on the request. Okay, so we are going to call it user ID. Let's add from middleware. Okay, middleware. Actually, this is optional. Like I said, you have the option of doing all of this on the page. On the page, you can just grab the cookies, get the user session. Okay, after getting the user session, validate if the session is in your Redis database, and then use the ID for whatever purpose you want to use it for. What I'm doing now is just to avoid making duplicate requests to our Redis database, since we've made the same request in our middleware, so we can just pass along the ID and the role. Okay, so I'm going to call this user ID, user role from middleware. Okay, I'm going to change this ID to role. Okay, what I did there is to change the ID to string. You know, by default, from what we are getting from our Redis database, the ID is of data type number. Okay, so this template literal is going to change it to string, because headers should always be string. Now we need to pass a user role. Okay, so I'm going to have session dot user dot role. Okay, there should be a comma here. All right, so this is going to undo any request that is made to a protected route. Okay, if the session is not valid, we direct them to sign in. If the session is valid, then we allow them to proceed to the dashboard. At this point, we can test what we've done so far. Okay, so let's go to our page. I'm going to refresh this. Okay, we are currently having error because our user is currently not logged in. You know, you can remember the other time I deleted the session ID. So when the user was trying to access the dashboard, the user was redirected to the sign-in page. Where is it? Okay, so the user was redirected to the sign-in page at this point, but our sign-in page is part of the public route, and we've not undone the public route, so it is causing an endless redirect. That is why we have this error. So we need to handle a public route. Okay, so after handling the public route, we are going to be testing everything all together. Okay, so in our public route block, we first need to validate our session. So we're going to call this session, then we're going to await the check session function. Okay, so we need to pass the request. So now we need to check if our session is valid or not valid. So we are going to say if our session dot is valid is not true. Okay, so if the session is not valid, then we can just allow the user to pass, because it is a public route. So public routes do not need valid sessions to be accessible. Okay, so we can just allow the user to pass through. But before we allow the user to pass through, you know, there is the possibility that the user ID, this header is already on the request. Okay, so we need to delete this header if it is on the request, since this is a public route. Okay, so if the session is not valid, then we need to delete those headers from the request. So first off, let's clone all the available headers first. Okay, so we're going to have new, then we have headers. Okay, so we're going to pass request dot headers. That is going to create a clone of our current headers. Okay, so we need to delete the two headers that we set earlier. Okay, just so they are not passed along to our public routes. Okay, so that's going to delete that. Then let's just duplicate this, and then we're going to call this role. Okay, so that's going to delete all the headers that all the custom headers that we set. Okay, now let's create our response. Okay, so response is going to be next response dot next. Okay, so we should allow the user to proceed to the page they want to access, since public routes do not need valid sessions to be accessed. Okay, so we're going to have a headers. Okay, and this is going to be request headers. All right, I hope we actually set it properly when we were setting it here. Sorry, like we are supposed to pass a request object here. So inside of the request object, we are going to have headers. Then we have our request headers. We are supposed to pass the headers alongside with the request that is proceeding to the dashboard page. Okay, so we're also passing the headers alongside the request that is proceeding to the public route after deleting the custom headers that we set earlier on. Okay, now after creating the response, we need to check if the session asks us to delete the session. So we are going to say if session.delete session. If it is true, then we are going to have response.cookies.delete. Okay, so we need to pass the cookie session key. All right, so after that, we need to return our response. Okay, response. Now for public routes, if the session is valid, this block is to undo invalid sessions, and for public routes, invalid sessions should proceed to public routes. But if the session is valid, a signed in user should not be able to access our sign in page, our sign up page, our forgot password page, because the user is already signed in. Okay, so if the session is valid, then we are going to be redirecting the user back to the dashboard. Okay, a user that is in dashboard already that wants to access a sign-in page without signing out, so we are just going to redirect them back to the dashboard. They are not going anywhere without signing. We're going to have that redirect. Okay, so we'll be directing them back to the dashboard. Okay, so we have a dashboard. Okay, this is going to be request URL. Okay, so with this, we've completed our middleware. It's as simple as that. Okay, so now let's test our app. Let's refresh our sign in page. Okay, so now let's sign in. All right, our password. Okay, so we should be able to access our dashboard. Okay, because we just signed in, we have a valid session. We don't have our logout button yet. Okay, so I'm going to delete our session manually. Go to application. Right, so this is our session ID. I'm going to delete this session ID. Okay, so now I'm going to refresh our dashboard page. Okay, on refresh, we are supposed to be directed to sign in. Okay, you can see that. So our middleware is working perfectly. Okay, I'm going to log in again, and then I'm going to try to go to sign in page. Okay, password, login. All right, so currently now I'm signed in, and by the design of our middleware, a user that is already signed in should not be able to access either sign up page or sign in page. So I'm going to try to access sign up page now. I'm supposed to redirect it back to the dashboard. Okay, so you can see now a user that is already signed in cannot go to the sign in page or sign up page or the home page. Okay, those are public routes. All right, so to access that, you need to sign out. Okay, and like I said in our last video, there are some part of your pages that you might want them to be dynamic. For example, here we have admin user. So what if our user is a regular user? Okay, so we need to make this part dynamic. All right, and since we've passed down the user role and the user ID onto the request as headers on the request, then we can just grab the user role from headers in our page. Okay, so here we can just come here, we can say const, let's say headers, let's call it headers list. Okay, so here we are going to await it. Headers is it's an asynchronous function that is going to get headers for us. Okay, so we can say const user role is equal to headers list. Okay, dot get, and then we need to pass the ID of the header. So I'm just going to copy this. Okay, then I'm going to paste it here as a string. All right, so that's going to give us the user role. Okay, so on this point I'm going to make this dynamic. All right, so I'm going to say user role, if user role equals admin. Okay, then we're going to be displaying admin user. But if user role is not admin, then we're just going to display regular user. Okay, so this is the whole point of the headers that we pass down to that we pass down as part of the headers in a request. Okay, this is the whole point of it. You know, assuming we did not pass where is our middleware, assuming we did not pass down these headers as part of the request, so that means on our page we need to first get the user ID, make a request to our Redis database, check if the user is in the database. If the user is in the database, then we're going to get their role from there. But since we've already made that network request on our middleware, so we can just pass down whatever we need as part of the request. Okay, and then we get it from the header. So if we run this now, so on our dashboard you can see now we have regular user. The other time we add admin user, okay, which was hard coded. So we need to change this also to be dynamic. So we're going to go to where we have role. Okay, so this is going to be user role. Okay, so if we save that, so if the user is admin, it is going to be admin. If the user is a regular user, it is going to be user. Okay, so that will be all for this video. The next video we are going to be rendering our logout button. Okay, don't forget to give this video a like and subscribe to the channel so that you'll be notified when the next video is available. All right, that'll be all for now, and I'll be seeing you in the next video.